The creature stirred under a shadow where his reason for being was stolen from itself in a gulf of shame, a guilt that played upon his mind that conferred this sentence of self-conviction, the fiat of his suffering. As he claimed responsibility for their victimization, to seek a divestment from the demonization of his own identity, his self-proclaimed victims moved to occupy his realms and to denigrate the pedagogy of his foundational beliefs. Thus he welcomed the world that he had purportedly exploited and begged them to live on the repayment of his charity. But the rebellion of his arms claimed his abuse for generations and demanded his demise for their inheritance of pain. As he lay stymied in the futility of this act of repentance, in the solicitation of a resentment that is unwilling to change, his body lay paralyzed in this polarization of intentions and torn from within by its fractions underneath. Now the wounded Kraken lies prostrate and stricken as a failed experiment in a predacious democracy, as his once valorous appendages flail on the rocks, and his enumerated powers have grown out of sync, to lie tragically in the waste of his historical experiment, in the repatriation of adherents of incompatible creeds. But an unforeseen consequence of the coercion of diversity, with its preclusion of the cohesion of a unifying theme. Now the maelstrom of currents lifts his body aloft as his eyes perceive the darkness that has fixed him in its gaze, into the spiraling frenzy of an unwilling service to the unknown creatures floating above the tortuous waves. As the sinews of hemp restrict his capacity for movement and draw his arms to his head in a final commingling, to have an envious view of the birds of a feather who flock concordantly in the shelter of the bower of trees. Like an aromatic's awakening with its leaves bound to its stalk, as if to cure in the dark for another's consumption, and as his arms recoil in a phantasmic shock, with the exactitude of a knife swung in 8 gracious movements, as his aggregate parts are dispensed into a melting pot and distilled into the melange of his unsavory vestige, until his body grows numb to its former renown, and his achievements are omitted from a new historical record. Now his eyes finally close to the sounds of a knell and the memories of life in a nascent death's reverie, of a maxim unheeded: to destroy oneself in the service to others is to fulfill the last act of another's deceit. For a once proud legacy of this most powerful of creatures, who grew so many arms that his head could not lead, as his empire lay ruined by his self-abnegation, that exchanged individual freedom for a collection of suffering.